On the morning of May 13, 1942, in the dimly lit cabinet room at 10 Downing Street, the air was thick with tension. Prime Minister Winston Churchill, his brow furrowed in determination, stood before his cabinet members as yet another debate about the grim state of the war in North Africa unfolded. Reports from the front lines painted a dire picture. British and Allied forces were stumbling, caught in a perilous struggle against Axis powers bolstered by formidable German General Erwin Rommel. The stakes had never been higher, and whispers of defeat threatened to seep into the heart of British morale. "Gentlemen," Churchill began, his voice cutting through the murmurs of doubt that hung in the room, "we cannot allow ourselves to retreat. To surrender now would not only signify a loss of ground, it would mark the end of our spirit of resistance." His words were not merely rhetoric, they were a rallying cry infused with the weight of history and the heavy burden of leadership in wartime. The cabinet was divided. Some members, haunted by recent setbacks and under mounting pressure from military advisors, urged a reconsideration of the North African strategy. The fear of an irrevocable defeat loomed large, casting shadows over yesterday's victories. A retreat, they argued, was preferable to risking greater losses and further eroding confidence in Churchill's leadership. But his voice remained resolute, echoing in the hallowed halls with an intensity that demanded attention, respect, and ultimately loyalty. This was no ordinary meeting. It was a crucible of leadership, a moment where the fate of nations could pivot on the conviction of a single man. As he surveyed the faces of his cabinet, Churchill sensed reluctance and trepidation, yet he also glimpsed flickers of resolve in those who understood that surrender was a greater risk than continued conflict. "We must remember," he asserted, "that victory does not come to those who cease to fight." His piercing gaze locked onto those who dared to question the resolve of their campaign. "What would history say of us if we faltered now? We owe it to our forebears and future generations to stand firm." This declaration would not simply influence a cabinet meeting. It would forever alter the trajectory of the war and define Churchill's legacy as a leader defined by his unyielding spirit. His words had the power to ignite commitment, turning apprehension into actionable resolve. In that moment, with time ticking away on the broader war effort, a palpable shift occurred among the assembled men. Churchill's impassioned defiance would inspire them all to dig in their heels, collectively deciding that surrender was not an option. The backdrop to Churchill's fervent proclamation was one of dire consequence. North Africa had become a theater of brutal engagement, a test not just of military prowess, but of national will. Over the preceding months, the Axis powers had leveraged their blitzkrieg tactics to such devastating effect that victory seemed increasingly elusive for the Allies. The Battle of Gazala was fast approaching, and reports from the front hinted at both logistical failures and low troop morale, casting shadows over a campaign that had once promised swift triumph. Churchill knew all too well that historically significant moments are shaped by human egos and the political pressures of the day. He recalled conversations in the weeks prior, filled with whispers of caution and requests for a strategic withdrawal. "The people expect boldness, not timidity," he had thought to himself in quieter moments, all while feeling the incessant weight of expectation on his shoulders. When the War Cabinet convened in early May, these pressures escalated, forcing him to confront the dangerous crossroads at which they stood. The stakes transcended mere military strategy. They represented the essence of British resilience against tyranny. For Churchill, whose political career had weathered storms of criticism and change, the ramifications of any retreat would be incalculable. His fierce pride and commitment to preserving the nation's spirit drove him to fiercely oppose any notion of surrender. Instead, he saw an opportunity. This moment could galvanize his cabinet, uniting them against the challenges posed by both the enemy and the dawning uncertainty within their own ranks. Could this stand be the turning point? As his cabinet debated, letters from field commanders such as General Sir Claude Auchinleck, who believed that a retreat would lead to chaos, landed on the table, intensifying the urgency of the conversations. "We risk losing the confidence of our soldiers and civilians alike," Auchinleck had warned, believing that a robust commitment to North Africa was essential not only for military success, but for preserving public morale. Meanwhile, Nazi propaganda continued its relentless assault, seeking to exploit perceived fissures within British resolve. Those assembled understood what was at stake. Each cabinet member felt the suffocating pressure to either align with Churchill's steadfast vision or capitulate to the growing tide of doubt. As the air thickened with contention, the collective responsibility of leadership became palpable, a shared burden carried by men who had once fought side by side in World War I. How could they honor that legacy in the face of potential collapse?
As debates raged, Churchill's fiery rhetoric about fighting to maintain the spirit of Britain struck a chord, echoing throughout the room with increasing fervor. He invoked not just the will to survive, but the determination to thrive. "This is our moment of truth," he declared, igniting a sense of urgency that could not be quenched. Churchill's indomitable spirit was beginning to permeate the consciousness of his cabinet. They were standing at the precipice of irreversible decisions that would shape not just the war, but the very identity of the nation. As the debate reached a fever pitch, Churchill seized the moment to articulate the monumental choice that lay before his colleagues. He framed the situation as not merely a consideration of military tactics, but an existential battle for the future of Western civilization. "We are not just fighting for land, we are fighting for our very way of life," he declared, his voice resonating with a conviction that compelled attention from even the most skeptical attendees. This was a desperate plea for unity in the face of adversity, one that sought to bridge the widening chasm between fear and resolve. On that fateful day, letters flew across the room. Minister of War Anthony Eden, typically reserved in his demeanor, took up the pen. "We must convey to our troops that their sacrifices have meaning, that they serve a greater cause," he wrote, echoing Churchill's sentiments. Yet doubts lingered, articulated by cautious voices that warned of potential pitfalls in the weeks ahead. The arrival of telegrams from frontline generals weighed heavily on the minds of the cabinet. They contained reports of dwindling supplies, low morale among troops, and a directive from some military advisors suggesting a step back while they regrouped. Even as discouraging opinions cascaded in, Churchill's defiance began to rally support. Guest Minister Lord Beaverbrook openly declared, "The Germans are already overextended. A display of tactical audacity can turn the tide in our favor." His words hung in the room, piercing through the fog of uncertainty and igniting a flicker of defiance among the cabinet members. In the face of such counsel, they could either choose to yield to anxiety or stand firm as they had done before. The room's atmosphere darkened with tension as they grappled with psychological fatigue and the looming specter of failure. Somewhere deep within the haze of political maneuvering, an ultimatum crystallized. The cabinet faced a clear choice: to realign their strategic vision with Churchill's fervent desire to continue the campaign, or to risk the scorn of history by retreating. As he paced the room, Churchill gestured emphatically to the maps laid spread before them, adorned with marked troop movements and potential objectives. "We cannot cower before our adversaries," he bellowed, "for surrender would mean forfeiting our spirit and our resolve.
The clock ticks forward. Each passing second amplifies the weight of their decisions. Churchill urged them to act decisively, warning them that their hesitation would irrevocably alter the course of the war. "We are not permitted to falter. We must march forward, shoulder to shoulder," he insisted, eyes blazing with the fierce determination that had defined his career. The cabinet felt them, the stakes, the weight of legacy, and they realized that they stood not just before political elections or military setbacks, but at a junction that could determine the fate of nations. Finally, as tensions crested, Churchill issued his unequivocal directive: "We shall not retreat. We shall fight." In that moment, something shifted. The cabinet, once divided, began to coalesce around one central tenet that had defined Churchill's leadership: resilience in the face of overwhelming odds. With their unity reaffirmed, they chose their path. The escalated confrontation would not lead to weakness, but rather an opportunity to reclaim the narrative of resistance.
As the cabinet members exchanged resolute glances, a definitive course was set. The decision to continue the campaign in North Africa, crucial and irrevocable, echoed loudly in their minds as they mulled over the ramifications. Churchill's forceful commitment to resisting the Axis powers ignited their sense of purpose. Despite the shadows of vulnerability looming over them, they embraced the resolve coalescing within the room. In the subsequent days, the echoes of their decision reverberated across the British Empire, and plans for the upcoming assaults in the desert were hastily prepared with newfound urgency. However, the price of unwavering obstinacy was high. Churchill recognized that confidence could not replace adequate military support. Behind closed doors, he arranged a series of meetings with military commanders to ensure that resources, including tanks and supplies, were made available for the campaign. He understood the grave implications of the directive at hand. It wasn't just about facing the enemy, it was about aligning forces and strategies that could turn the tide of the war. Pressures mounted from all sides. Operational capabilities had to be enhanced to match the ambition behind the cabinet's decision. On May 28th, as the sun rose over the harsh landscapes of North Africa, the day of reckoning arrived. The Allies heralded their determination through a prepared assault on Gazala, bolstered by Churchill's defiance. The mood among troops who had been previously demoralized by doubt now brimmed with a revived spirit. They marched into battle under the banner of reclaiming dignity for Britain. General Auchinleck's stern face reflected the collective resolve of the men behind him, whispering promises of victory to the rushed preparations for battle. The confrontation loomed large. The stakes were undeniably high. In the swirling dust of the battlefield, British forces made their move against Rommel's Africa Corps. A fierce clash ensued, a series of engagements that would ultimately culminate in the Battle of Gazala. With each advancing unit, Churchill's bold declaration loomed in their minds. This day was their test of endurance, a crucible where losses could not be an option, where courage met the call of history directly. But the battle did not unfold as seamlessly as fate promised. As tanks thundered across the arid terrain and the deafening sound of artillery erupted, British troops found themselves caught in a harrowing fight against overwhelming odds. Despite initial advances, chaos reigned. Commanders frantically relayed orders to halt unless reinforcements could arrive, a situation reminiscent of earlier engagements where hesitation had spelled disaster. Reports began to filter back of casualties mounting, morale fluctuating, and the harsh realities of war piercing the veil of resolve. With every letter and cable reaching Churchill's desk, the severity of the situation became painfully clear. His heart raced at the thought of the lives being sacrificed. He could not escape the haunting notion of George C. Marshall's words,
A leader, at the end of the day, is only as good as their ability to protect the lives of those who follow. The gravity of decisions weighed heavily upon him. Faced with the flickering lantern light illuminating documents stacked beside him, he felt the shifting power dynamics of the battlefield seep into the very fabric of his resolve, a leader bearing the burdens of command.
The aftermath of the Battle of Gazala arrived with the brutal clarity of reality, exposing the consequences of a decision irrevocably made. British forces faced mounting casualties amid the arid expanse of North Africa. The initial optimism instilled by Churchill's defiance began to wane as losses escalated. Reports flooded into London, detailing not just fatalities, but the devastation of morale among troops who had bravely advanced but were now struggling against a tenacious enemy. The grim face of war was evident, its toll manifesting in far more than just numbers. Churchill himself was drawn into the turmoil. As he huddled with his advisers in the war room, he felt the biting chill of regret inching into his conscience. The sweeping confidence with which he had advocated for continued engagement now collided headlong with the simmering reality of battlefield failures. The cabinet, once unified, began to fracture under the weight of accountability. Voices of dissent emerged, reverberating through the corridors of power, as those who had initially supported the campaign now raised concerns. "What have we wrought?" they asked, the echoes of discontent denting the familiar steadfastness of their leader. Yet, amidst the burgeoning frustration, there remained unyielding support from key figures. Eden, steadfast beside Churchill, penned a letter emphasizing the necessity of perseverance in light of recent setbacks. "Our cause remains just," he asserted, urging cohesion during this tumultuous period. However, momentum was slipping. As more cables from field commanders arrived, detailing dire shortages of supplies, they underscored the flaws inherent in the earlier decisions. The strategic miscalculations of their campaign risked eroding not only victories, but also the foundational spirit that Churchill had drawn upon to unify his cabinet. As months passed, the consequences persisted, and the repercussions of the decision reverberated throughout British military ranks. The initial thrust into North Africa faltered, but Churchill's defiance had ignited an indomitable spirit among the Allied forces, despite the bitter price they paid. This was a moment not just of miscalculation, but of profound transformation. Commands issued under pressure birthed a turning point, an unwillingness to surrender, and a tenacious refusal to compromise the moral fiber of resistance emerged stronger than before. The grave realities set forth during those fateful days in May would shape a legacy far beyond any individual action. Churchill's unwavering stance may have momentarily led to misjudgments on the battlefield, but it also laid bare the complexities of leadership in war, a juxtaposition of boldness entwined with miscalculation. The echoes of this historic moment resonated, illustrating that power dynamics can swiftly shift and moments of sheer resolve can have far-reaching consequences. Ultimately, the decision made on that pivotal day in May 1942 marked not just a confrontation with Axis forces, but a profound assertion of British resilience. Churchill emerged with a fortified reputation, a leader unyielding in the face of adversity, embodying the relentless fighting spirit that would rally the nation through the darkest chapters of the war. In a broader context, this moment represented the irreversible decision to stand against tyranny, a commitment to the values held dear by free nations. This stand was not merely about the alliances forged on the battlefield. It signified the tenacity of the human spirit poised against overwhelming odds.